Hello and welcome to our weekly Torah Talk. Our guest today is Rabbi Aaron Alexander, Associate Dean of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies at the American Jewish University. Hello, Rabbi, and thank you for being with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Shmuel.
Our Parsha is Teitzei from the book of Devarim. In this Parsha we find 74 of the Torah's 613 commandments, mitzvot. Among these 74 mitzvot, the laws of the beautiful captive, the rebellious son returning a lost object, sending away the mother bird before taking her young, penalties for adultery, the prohibition against turning in an escaped slave, and so on and so forth. It begins with this pasuk, כי תצא למלחמה על אויביך, ונתנו אדוני אלוהיך בידיך ושבית שביו. If you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God will deliver him into your hands, and you take his captives. That's the first pasuk. So we begin with a rule of war against other people, but later in the parsha we find other rules governing our relations with other nations. And this is the topic I would like to talk about. Here's one pasuk. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. Even the 10th generation shall never enter the assembly of the Lord. Why?
Well, so the first thing I think that we need to explain is that, one, the 10th generation does mean eternally. One might think, since this parsha refers to certain groups of people in the 3rd generation or the 10th generation, that eventually somebody is in, and that's actually not the case. The 10th generation is a way of saying forever. The 3rd generation, actually, which we'll see about, for instance, the Egyptians, does actually mean the 3rd generation. So I think the Torah in some ways is confusing here. The second piece that I just want to say briefly is Bikal Adonai, in the congregation of God, has a very specific meaning in the Torah. It doesn't mean necessarily the people Israel or the Israelite people.
Okay.
What it means is that in antiquity, there was probably a somewhat small compared to the entire Israelite nation, group of people surrounding Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, who assisted him in governing the community. So when the Torah specifically says Kehillah, community, it probably means in this context that small group of people. So the catch is this, and here's how the rabbis and other commentators expand it. In order to be a part of that community, that governing community, one would need to actually be able to be a member of the Israelite community. So it's the chicken or the egg type of thing. The answer, now I'll answer your question.
Okay.
There are certain groups amongst the Canaanite nations and beyond that have been excluded from the Israelite people, or that were excluded from the Israelite people in biblical times. And one might want to claim that this is an issue of simply there's the Israelite people and there is the other. But in actuality, or more likely, I should say, is that these prohibitions are based on historical circumstances. And the historical circumstances that we think surrounded the Ammoni and the Moavi are that when Israel was escaping Egypt, these are two groups of people who had the chance to offer assistance in very concrete and tangible ways and chose not to. Whether that's actually true, even in the Torah itself, is up for debate. In fact, it actually looks like the Moabites did assist the Israelite people.
The people of Israel, right.
But at least according to this narrative, the Devarim narrative, which often has slight differences or significant differences, we're talking about a group of people for whom their nationality is less important than their character.
Right, and we can see in this parsha that for other people, there are different rules. Later in the parsha, the Torah specifically says, you shall not despise an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not despise an Egyptian, for you were a sojourner in his land. So you have different rules for different people, and it's not exactly clear always why.
I find that the distinction between the Egyptians and, let's say, the 7 Canaanite nations or the Ammoni and the Moabi to be quite fascinating.
Almost puzzling. You'd expect the Torah to tell us to hate the Egyptians forever,
right.
not other people.
2 things about the Egyptians that I think are worth noting. One is at the end of Bereshit, it's the Egyptians who actually help at least whoever the early Jewish people are, the Abraham and Sarah clan, actually get them out of a famine,
right,
and take them in,
and later Jacob and his family, and Joseph, of course.
Right, that's right. So when I said historical circumstances rather than nationality, historical circumstances, memory, which we'll talk about, matters. What is it that we remember about the character of somebody? The second thing is, and maybe the difference that separates, let's say, the Moabites and the Egyptians, is that when the Egyptians enslaved and then went after the Israelite people in the desert, it's not clear that they were going after them simply to destroy them or to make sure that they failed or suffered. They had a gross misperception of their own self-power and worth in the world, such that they didn't feel they could exist without subjugating another people. That's bad, quite sinful, but I don't think it's as significantly nefarious as, say, seeing somebody out in the middle of the road who is in need and turning your back around and saying no simply because you devalue everything that is human about them. That's going to be a significant difference with Amalek as well that we'll see. And so I do think there's a qualitative difference, at least as the Torah sees it, in terms of the Egyptians versus some of these other nations that didn't assist the Israelite people along the way, who were in fact, escaping, looking for freedom. It doesn't justify, the Egyptian narrative in the Torah, but I think it separates it a little bit.
Right, and you already mentioned the Amalek. This parsha ends with the most difficult case of all. You shall obliterate the remembrance of Amalek from beneath the heavens. You shall not forget. That's the last pasuk of the parsha. And the case of Amalek is also fascinating and troubling at times.
I think it's very troubling. There's a part of me that is always wary of hyperbole. In the midst of passion and emotion, all of us use it on a regular basis, and I don't think we actually mean precisely what we say. So, yesterday was the worst day of my life. I wish it never happened. I say that sometimes, but when I use language like that, do I really mean that I wish yesterday never happened? Is all of yesterday really the worst thing that happened to me, or did I wake up in the morning alive? And on and on and on. So I think one of the things we have to be wary of when we're reading ancient text that is at least intending to express the deepest emotions of a religious people coming out of trauma and then being kicked as they're falling down. And literally, Amalek, whatever happened there, we're going after at least as Devarim tells it, not as Exodus tells it, we're going after precisely those in our society who we ought to be uplifting and elevating more than anybody else. Those who cannot fend for themselves and are in a situation in which nobody's looking out for them because they're in the back. Everybody's running forward. Nobody sees those who are in the back. And so the hyperbole, I think, is used here to remind us that this, and this is Drash now, clearly, that this is who we all are on a regular basis. We are both running away, forgetting who is behind us, and we are chasing after other people. And the moment in which you think that you're running or you're chasing cannot impact the people who are around you, the moment that radical self-interest becomes the rule, is when the character, not the nationality, of Amalek becomes destructive. And for that, I do believe, remember and never forget. And those, one is active and one is passive. And they're actually quite different, and I believe not redundant in the Torah.
Thank you, Rabbi. There's so much more to talk about in this parsha. We'll probably do it next year.
Thank
you. Shabbat Shalom.
It's an honor. Shabbat Shalom.